When is it best to give advice and how would you go about doing it? That's what we'll explore in this session. So the objectives of this session are that at the end you'll be able to assess the role of giving advice in mentoring, analyse critical factors in advice giving, and evaluate some models of advice giving. This exercise is to help you start to think about giving advice and what helps and hinders that process. Think back to a time when you were last given some advice that you welcomed and acted on. Write down what it was about your frame of mind, the advice and the circumstances at the time that meant that you decided to welcome it. Then think back to a time when you were last given some advice that you resisted. Write down what it was about your frame of mind, the advice and the circumstances at the time that meant that you decided to resist it. This is a follow-up exercise from the last one. From the answers to the last exercise, write down in what circumstances would giving advice be useful for your student. And what are some of the disadvantages of giving advice when mentoring? Here are some answers that you may have thought of. Firstly, we're thinking about when to give advice. And it's when it's something that the student couldn't work out for themselves. And by that I mean that they do not at the moment have enough information to be able to work it out. For instance, who they should talk to find some information they need, or specialist knowledge that only you will have. For example, you may be privy to some future plans about the organisation that would affect a decision the student wants to make. Then there is the type of advice where there is only one way of doing something. For example, if your student wanted to help in developing a new strategy where there were some statutory requirements as far as employment law is concerned. Giving advice is also useful when the student is totally new to a particular role or organisation. In this situation, being a little more directive can be very helpful in getting the student to settle in and be more productive more quickly. Then advice is sometimes useful when there are time pressures and perhaps your student has to do something as a matter of urgency and would like some support. As a mentor's role is to support the learning and development of the student, then giving advice should be used with great caution. And here are some of the disadvantages that you may have considered. When we give advice to someone, it comes from our way of thinking, our background and experience, our model of the world. Your student will have a different one. So even though the advice worked for you, for the student it's far less likely to fit into his or her way of thinking. And because of that, the student is far less likely to be committed to the action than if they were coached to a solution. When a mentor frequently gives advice, not only is there usually less commitment, but also it breeds dependency on the mentor. The student will stop thinking for themselves and rely on the mentor for all answers. This has many impacts, not the least being that it lessens the learning, the very thing the mentoring was set up to increase. But it also denies opportunities for experiential learning and experimentation, and the huge value that can come out of that. So as a mentor, you'll want to use advice giving with great care. It's very powerful when it's used in the right circumstances, but there are some mentors who think that their job is to tell people what to do, and those types of relationships prove far less successful and effective. So what's the best way to give advice? In Feng's study, the question examined was whether it was important to offer emotional support before, after, or not at all when giving advice. The findings from this study were that advice works better when it's offered after some form of emotional support. And it also found that there was no difference in the evaluation of the advice if there was no emotional support or if there was emotional support after the advice giving. This would suggest that emotional support after giving advice is not of much value. The purpose of the emotional support is to change the state of the student so that they are in a more receptive frame of mind. Another key finding was that an important part of the inquiry and analysis was to ascertain if advice should be given or not. So in the EPA model, the first thing is to offer emotional support, then inquiring into and analysing the problem, and then, if it feels appropriate, give advice. In this next model, Weingarten highlights the importance of listening. The purpose of this being that not only will you discover where the student is starting from and the details of the problem, but also because you've listened to them, the student is more likely to listen to you. Listening will also help you decide whether it is advice the person wants, or do they just want to have someone to listen to them and get it off their chest. The second is to ask permission. Unasked for advice is often taken as an interference, even in a mentoring relationship. So you can ask permission first and make sure that the advice is going to be considered. For example, to say, "I've got a few thoughts about this, would it be useful to have them?" Or to make sure that you will be all right whatever answer you get from this. It's the student's outcome and they'll want to take full responsibility for it. And finally, there is the step of offering the advice without insisting in any way. Our job is to offer the advice. The student's job is to decide if for him or her it's what they want to do. That is entirely their choice, and they will also be responsible for the outcome of their decision. Here are some other factors to consider. Making judgments about what has happened is rarely helpful. For example, if you begin by something along the lines of, "Well, you should have," or "That was a stupid thing to do." And the response is usually better if you can give advice on what is advisable to do rather than on what they should avoid doing. For example, you may find the best result comes from being well prepared, rather than, "Don't go to the meeting with all your papers in a mess." This will make sure the student is focusing on positive outcomes rather than negative ones. The type of language you use will be important in being able to influence your student. You'll get better results if you listen carefully to the type of language the student uses and then use the same type back at them when you're giving your advice. Pick up on their keywords and phrases and the way they prefer to express things. This will enhance rapport. You can often have greater influence by turning the advice into questions. For example, rather than saying, "My advice to you is to tell them that you're going to report them to the manager," you can turn it into a question by saying, "What I've found in the past is that it's best to tell them you're going to report them to the manager. Would that help in this situation?" Here's an exercise to think a little bit more about giving advice to students. Think of 3 different people you know. Imagine that you're going to give them advice on how to mentor someone. Write the same advice in 3 different ways to suit the 3 people. What differences did you make and why? Which parts of the models that we've considered would be most important for which of the 3 people?